On this, the July 20th, 2022 edition of What the Ship, U.S. container imports continue to rise. The importance of Brazil in global trade. U.S. exports of diesel and gas are climbing. Labor and strikes around the world. And what's going on with U.S. coastal trade? Hi, and welcome to this edition of What's Going On with Shipping, the What the Ship edition. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. If you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. So before we jump into the top 5 stories as of July 20th, let me do a quick little update on some previous stories we looked at this week. So one of the stories we looked at was the fire that took place on board the Peruvian warship, the BAP Geese. 2 crew members had been taken off the vessel because of burns. The vessel had suffered an engine room fire that went over 5.5 hours. The USNS Grasp, a military Sealift Command salvage vessel, had sortied out to get the ship. The Grasp is back at its berth in Pearl Harbor. It arrived on scene. The fire was under control at that point, and the Coast Guard cutter on scene, the Midget, and provided the tow. And right now, the Midget is towing the Geese back into port. You see her coming in at 3.8 knots. You may ask, well, wait a minute, why didn't you have the towing and salvage vessel tow her in? Midget and Geese are taking place in RIMPAC. RIMPAC is a large exercise, the largest U.S. naval exercise in the Pacific, and real-world training is tried at all times. The Midget had already passed a tow line to the Geese, and there was no reason to break that tow since the Midget was already doing it, and it is a mission for the national security cutters to be able to tow vessels. So she is towing the Geese into the port at Pearl Harbor. No telling what damage has been done in the engine room of the vessel. It will obviously take some repairs at Pearl Harbor to get her back in service so that she can sail back to Peru. Other story we did was on the Bonhomme Richard fire. An update on that, which was dealing with the punishments that were doled out to the 20 crew members. A lot of interest in this video. I really recommend that if you found that video good, I have a 2-part video I did. Part 1 is on the timeline of the fire, of the day of the fire, from the outbreak of the fire at 0800 that morning until the smoke explosion on board that really marked the end of the vessel. By that point, the fire basically determined the fate of the vessel. The second video is an analysis on what went right, what went wrong based on the JAGMAN investigation and people I've talked to. I have to say that I've gotten so many emails and comments on this. If you want to look at some great comments, look at the comments on these videos. But nearly every email I got not only confirmed what I talked about in these videos, but went a step further. It's like, oh, you've only scratched the surface. Strongly recommend, if you are interested in this video, take a look at the other 2. I'll have the link to them above so that you can get to them, and I'll also have them in the show notes. And then last, we talked about the Margaritaville at Sea, not going to sea. Back last Wednesday, a week ago today, the Margaritaville at Sea was scheduled for a departure on July 13th. That got canceled by the Coast Guard. However, the ship did sail on Friday, the day this video came out. So what I was talking about was the previous 2 days she had not been allowed to sail. Checked up on this, looked at the Coast Guard site. She still hasn't been updated for a new certificate of compliance yet. She's still showing the old one, and I went back in to see what the deficiencies were, and they are currently not listed. However, we'll continue to take a look at this and monitor it. All right, that was our update. Let's go ahead and jump into story number 1. Story number 1 brings us over to Lodestar, a story from Lodestar that's featured on GCaptain. U.S. container import rise in June as congestion shifts east. So a lot of talk about freight recession took place a few months ago and created a fight between several leading maritime sites. However, one of the things that's very clear is this. Number 1, we are seeing a reduction in the amount of cargo being moved around the United States because of the recession, or not recession, but because of inflation, which could potentially lead to a recession. We're technically not in a recession yet. We're waiting for those numbers for the second quarter. However, what we are seeing is you have to remember that goods are shipped 120, 180 days in advance. And so a flood of goods is still coming into the United States. And what we're seeing here is that number based on John McCowan's latest report. And if you don't follow John McCowan on LinkedIn, you should. His monthly reports on containers are the the crown jewel in data that comes out. According to McCowan's report, U.S. container ports reached 2,164,789 TEUs last month. That's a 3% gain over May, a 5.1 increase in April, and represents a 26.9% increase on pre-pandemic levels of June 2019. But the biggest issue here is the tip of cargo going from the West Coast to the Gulf and East Coast, where we're seeing the East Coast increase in their size, with New York coming almost to the same level as LA, which is a really significant element. And we're seeing congestion now move. One of the things that John talks about, this is a quote from John in his report, this whack-a-mole effect where relief on the West Coast resulted from deployment changes led to moving some of that congestion to East and Gulf Coast ports, is yet another example of the network effects within container shipping systems that have been evident throughout the pandemic. This Bloomberg article on GCaptain, when will supply chains return to normal? One of the things I want to highlight in this article is just some of the data that Bloomberg put together here. If you want to see some great information here and you really want to crunch some data, here you go. Here's this inching back to normal. Oxford U.S. supply strain index has fallen for 3 straight months. So you see the supply strain kicking up here. And I always got to be careful about this. I always love when they say there, well, it's fallen for 3 straight months. Look at the level it's at. It's at a peak level. Again, we're at the top of Everest here and coming down the backside. So far, so good. Flexport data shows good purchases starting to slow versus services, which is good. Speaking of shortages, frequency of the Fed's referral to shortages in the Beige Book is declining. But again, look at the height it's at. It's at a pretty high index. Yeah, it's not above the 70 that it was, but still between 20 and 30 right now. Halfway back to normal, ocean shipping freight rates have dropped halfway back to early 2021 levels. Again, you're coming off Mount Everest, but you're still only halfway down, and you're still well above where we were pre-COVID, and the ocean carriers are doing a lot to keep those freight rates artificially high. European shipping snarls, we'll talk about this in a second, and then inbound cargo flows. U.S. container imports hit a record in May and showed little weakness going forward. And just to zip through these here, U.S. containerized imports keep record level pace in June, start strong in July. Container shipping spot rates still falling. What will be the new normal? The spot rates are falling, but the long-term rates are high. That's causing everybody to readjust and see where those freight rates come out. Global box port congestion sets fresh records high. This is a story from Sam Chambers at Splash 24/7, talking about the global backup. 37.8% of the box ship fleet capacity is at port, usually around 31.5%, an average between 2016 and 2019. Viewpoint, another round of COVID testing in China may mean more delays. I mean, we keep seeing this. Los Angeles port boss Gene Soroka had his interview, his monthly report, where he talked about that one of the big issues at LA and Long Beach is the rail service and the risk of a nationwide risk. And this talks about here that they're moving cargo at the speed of sloth. I'm not sure what the speed of sloth is. I assume it's slow, but that's a Lorianne Larocco report. And then one other one I want to add, because I had a viewer send me this, is CMA CGM had one of their ships, the APL Vanda, lose containers in the Indian Ocean. And this goes back to a larger issue of reliability and information coming from containers, shipping firms. This ship has been in Djibouti now for 2 weeks. We lost 55 containers. I overestimated that, 55. But the problem is that the container stacks had suffered a collapse. And so they had to restack, readjust, but they have not been getting back to their shippers, the people who ship the cargo on them. And that story on Lodestar talks about the fact how people have been begging to find out what's going on with their cargo. Has it been lost? Has it been damaged? Is it coming on? When's it going to arrive? And APL, which is a subsidiary of CMA CGM, have been zero on communicating to them. And that's a problem with ocean shippers. They just do not treat their customers well in some cases. And we're seeing that right there from CMA CGM. So a lot going on with box ships, obviously, right now. All right, let's jump over to story number 2. Story number 2 deals with Brazil. And Brazil, for those of you unaware, is a major, major player in ocean shipping. Hop over to our buddies at Marine Traffic. Take a look at Brazil. Again, we don't talk enough about this market, but we need to. Look at the number of bulk vessels heading across here to Brazil, to the Rio de Plata, Argentina, Uruguay, up to Paraguay, but over here to Brazil, coming across, the number of tankers coming down along the coast, and the transaction or transition, the big X that crosses the Atlantic here from South Africa up into the Caribbean, and then along the coast of South America up toward Europe and the Mediterranean. Brazil is a huge major player here, not to mention the amount of exports that come out of Brazil. This story right here talks about inflation is fertilizer inflation forces overhaul of Brazil ports and railways. This Bloomberg story is talking about how much Brazil is adjusting to get more fertilizer in so that it can accommodate the need for food inflation around the world. Because of the conflict in the Black Sea between Russia and Ukraine, Brazil is pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into their infrastructure so that they can get fertilizer from the ports inland as fast as they can to increase their soybean, coffee, sugar production, along with grain. They're really looking to do this. The story talks about this. Farmers there buy a whopping 85% of their fertilizer off the world market, and usage has risen 30% since 2017 as outputs expand. Grain is also being cultivated in more far-flung regions like Northeast Brazil. Transportation is mostly done via truck, but there's so many crops and chemicals to move at such great distances, the system is strained. So they're investing in their waterways and their ports and infrastructure. Brazil is an emerging economy in terms of on the world surface. You know, it's one of the G20, it's out there, but more importantly, its role in providing ore and grain is absolutely vital. The Cape-wise vessels specifically call at Brazil, these vessels that go around the Cape of Good Hope, these large bulkers use that all the time. Have this story right here. Australia bets on Brazilian sugar ports. Again, a Reuters story where Australia is investing in Brazilian ports by taking a stake in port operator CLI and funding a deal to buy sugar and grain terminals in Latin America's largest port, Santos, for $260 million. A lot of investment going on right now south of the equator in Brazil. And you see that being played out here with Australia. And remember, Australia had gotten into a knockdown, drag-out fight with China during COVID over COVID restrictions. China boycotted out Australian grain and, more importantly, ore coming from Western Australia. And that hurt the Australians a lot. And so the Australians are looking for other places to sell their ore. They were doing it to India and a few other developing countries that, or I shouldn't say developing, but countries that are developing more and more industry, and India was one of them. But also to make alliances with other countries around the world, and a Southern Hemisphere one between Australia and Brazil makes a lot of sense. Then you add this story to it. This is a story that was in Splash 24/7. Sam Chambers, China Mineral Resource Group launches as Beijing attempts to assert dry bulk control. Beijing's long-planned initiative to wrestle back control of pricing of dry bulk commodities, particularly iron ore, has taken shape with the launching of the China Mineral Resource Group. State-run conglomerate has a registered capital of $3 billion and a business scope which covers activities including mining, ore processing, and trading. The group will manage mines as well as serve as a unified iron ore buying platform for steel mills in China. Go down here a little bit more. China is by some distances the world's largest iron ore buyer, taking more than 1 billion tons a year, accounting for around 70% of the global production. For the last 10 years, major steel producing nations have shifted from annual contract negotiations to an index price mechanism. Prices for iron ore have been highly volatile during the pandemic. And China knows this. They know this, and they are acting to get better and better control over this. And the creation of this institution is furtherment that we've seen of China through the Belt and Road Initiative to ensure their imports for raw materials. Again, I say this all the time. Everybody thinks China is an exporter. They're is just exporting. They're not. They're a massive importer. A lot of raw material, grain, ores, and finished products, manufactured products, come into China to be assembled together into eventually larger finished products. And so China is looking at the long game here. And unfortunately, too many countries, including the United States, are playing tic-tac-toe while China is playing four-dimensional chess. It is just that level that we're seeing take place here. All right. Let's go over to story number 3. Story number 3, how many of you caught yourself at the gas pump the other day and gas prices have fallen in some areas? I'm in North Carolina, has fallen to below $4 a gallon. And you're sitting there saying, yay, gas is so cheap now. And then you realize, what the hell did I just say? And I know it's more expensive in many areas. Don't scream at me. I know. California, you're on your own on that one. But, this little bit of reduction we're seeing in gas prices right now makes this story more infuriating, I'll say. Greg Miller, U.S. exports, shipping out of crude oil and diesel are climbing even higher. More diesel flows to Latin America, more crude to Europe. And one of the things that Greg is talking about here is how much of our diesel and gasoline is heading out. Citing ship movement data from Vortexa, Argus said that the diesel exports averaged 1.45 million barrels per day from July 1st to the 13th, more than in any month since July 2017. So we're shipping out more diesel now than ever before, with diesel being at its highest level. And when you start looking at exports here, you start seeing that how much of that crude condensate, how much of that clean product, and how many dirty products are going out. And you can see how July 2022 is really at one of the highest levels, peaks that we see, with more U.S. crude going to Europe, less to Asia. But the big story, I always say that Greg is hitting on here, and I think it's the one that no one ever talks about enough, is U.S. refining capacity has decreased. We have a refining capacity of between 16.5, 16.7 million barrels per day over recent months. That's in line with the 5-year average of roughly 1.4 million barrels per day. But what that is it's decreased over time. And we have shuttered 1.3 million barrels per day of refining capacity over the last year, 2020 to 2021. And that is a big issue, is we do not have the refining capacity. If you come over to my favorite report, the EIA, Energy Information Administration's This Week in Petroleum, which I know you all get because I've told you to get this report because it's a great report, you see several important things. One, you see that drop we're talking about in gasoline prices. But take those two big, huge dips, the one, or bumps, I should say, out for the invasion of Ukraine, the other one here for the peak of the July 4th. And if you follow that graph, we're back on track to where we see that growth. And notice how much higher we are than last year, over $1 higher, and that's increasing is what we're seeing. Same thing over here. If you start looking at the cash flow statements from 53 U.S. oil companies, this is their cash for operations versus their cash expenditures. Doing pretty good, making some good money there, oil companies. This report breaks it down in different levels. You can see the retail price here for gasoline. But what I want to really look at here is right here. What's the gasoline stocks by region? We see gas stocks for the East Coast had dipped down quite a bit. But again, we're still close to within average. We're climbing back up. We're below the 5-year average, but we're not quite there yet. If you look at distillate diesel fuel in particularly, one of the things you see here is how much higher diesel fuel has jumped. Big jump there because of the Russia-Ukraine war. But if you go here to region, we are below our 5-year average. Remember, I just talked about the fact that we're exporting more diesel now than ever before to Latin America. Why? Because it's cost effective, because the oil companies want to make more money and they know they can ship it out there and get it. If you look at distillate stocks, look at the East Coast, where we were in August of 20, talking about over 60 million barrels. And today we're under 30 million barrels. If you look at days of supply, where we're at, we're just over 28 days of supply. We had dipped below that. That's a pretty low level of days of supply. And so one of the things always I want to talk about here is the importance of following the data, so that when you start seeing diesel prices dropping and gasoline prices dropping, you're like, hooray, this is great. We're coming back down again. Yet oil companies are exporting gasoline and diesel at larger numbers than ever before into markets where they can make more money, decreasing the supply of gasoline and diesel in the United States. Because why? Because gasoline companies and oil companies want to make money. Their profit, it's capitalism. They're going to go where the profitability is. And again, this is one of the reasons why it's really, really important to have minimum standards for days of supply to ensure we have a reservoir of gasoline and diesel and oil in the United States, that we build back our refining capacity, and we have dedicated U.S. flag tankers to move crude and clean products up and down the coast should there be problems with the Colonial Pipeline or any other disruptions that happen due to natural or unnatural events, black swans. All right, let's jump to story number 4. Story number 4 is labor, and labor is in the catbird seat when it comes to negotiations right now. You cannot walk into a store anywhere where they're not looking for people to come work. And right now we're seeing labor negotiations around the world in the terms of ocean shipping. This story from Maritime Executive: Germany's North Sea ports face longest strike action in decades. Trade union giant United Services Union has called for a 48-hour workforce strike across terminals in the country after collective labor agreement negotiation with the Central Association of German Seaport Companies failed to reach a successful conclusion. The strike is set to run from 0600 on Thursday until 0600 on Saturday. It is the third industrial action in as many weeks and the longest in more than 40 years. Understand, shutting down ports in Germany has a massive impact for a couple of reasons. One, transshipment of containers coming to other countries, particularly the United States, take place in some of these German ports. Second, a lot of the cargo that's coming into those German ports aren't for Germany, but for Central and Eastern Europe. And so this is going to cause disruptions, including potentially arms and equipment heading toward Ukraine to fight Russia. From G Captain, South Korea's Yoon says DSME shipyard strike causing tremendous damage to nation shipbuilding. 3 countries build 93% of the world's ocean ships: China, Japan, and Korea. Korea is number 2. And Korea is always held up as this example. When anyone ever wants to talk about building ships in the United States, they use the example of Korea. Well, what you find out in this story is what everybody knows behind the scenes, but people don't want to tell you, so that when people will argue, well, it's really expensive to build ships in the US, look at what's been going on in Korea here. You're seeing this strike, and this strike is absolutely catastrophic for Korea. South Korea's third biggest shipbuilder has said the dispute cost it more than $400 million in mid-July and was likely to lead to delivery delays. About 76,000 subcontract shipyard workers were laid off between 2015 and 2020. For those who stayed, their wages were slashed by 30%. Contract workers are paid an average 60% less than the direct hires by the company. So one of the things that groups like Cato love to do is look at South Korean workers and sit there and say, look at the wages they get. They're comparable, if not higher than U.S. shipbuilding wages. Yeah, because they're looking at the full-time employees. They're not looking at the fact that what South Korea has done is gotten rid of a lot of their full-time workers and done these contractors, these subcontractors who get paid a lot less. And I hate to say it, but U.S. shipbuilding companies have done this a lot too. This is one of the biggest shipyards in the world, in one of the 3 biggest shipbuilding nations in the world, and they're contracting their labor force. This is going to have ramifications in the delivery of vessels and in the shipbuilding war that's going on between Japan, Korea, and China. Liverpool dock workers might strike over pay. In the United States, President Biden had to head off a rail strike with a 60-day cooling off period because the railways in the United States have not had a contract for 3 years. And they have cut down tremendously the amount of workers in their workforce. If you want the best article on this, Rachel Premack over at FreightWaves did a fantastic article on the railways. Add to this about labor issues that we see going on, protests at the Port of Oakland by truck drivers over the AB5 ruling that was done. Independent contractor law protest movement with 1,000 port drivers going in. What's interesting about this strike here, or this protest, is the ILWU, which is in the midst of this contract renegotiation, refused to walk across the picket line, which could resonate as California truckers deal with the AB5 ruling from the Supreme Court, we may see this spread to LA and Long Beach. And then finally, right here, the White House Industry Association press ILWU and PMA to get a new labor agreement. I keep hearing there's going to be one in August, but again, they're not talking. So we don't know for sure what the deal is here regarding the labor situation with the ILWU and the PMA. I am seeing both sides taking pot shots at each other. All right, let's head to our last story for the day. Last story today is always the story I like to choose, and this one deals with the inland and coastal waters of the United States. The Maritime Administration, the FMC, really need to draw more attention to this sector. So this story here by Joanna Marsh from FreightWaves, Inland Port Network coming to Mississippi River, talking about the movement of containers up the Mississippi by barge and small vessel. This is a big issue to try to get cargo off the highways and onto this north-south lane by using the inland waterways and take containers off terminals like in New Orleans, Mobile, and other places and get them on barge traffic so they can go. And this means developing inland ports to handle containers. You need cranes, you need laydown area, you need facilities to do that. And so there's a series of projects that are looking at this. Add to it this story in G Captain, Subchapter M Milestone, entire U.S. towing fleet, vessel fleet inspected for compliance as phase-in period ends. So there was a issue that happened here with something called Subchapter M, which the Coast Guard implemented about inspection. It went into effect in July of 2016. And basically what this does is it allows inspections to be done either by the Coast Guard or the Coast Guard approved third-party organization, including certain classification societies. Gets the Coast Guard out of having to do this themselves. They can get certified third-party groups to come in and do this. And so you've raised the standard for U.S. towing, and more importantly, there's now a compliance issue there that's at play. That's important in the inland waterways to make sure there are safe vessels operating on U.S. inland waters. And then the last story is this one, is the House of Representatives passed a crew mandate bill, which is seen as a gut punch to offshore wind. So one of the biggest areas right now in development is the offshore wind industry. And I'm not gonna lie, this is an area I don't have enough knowledge of, and I'm learning more and more about it because I want to be knowledgeable about a topic when I bring it to you. And I'm really looking to get some people who know the topic to come on and talk about it. But what the House has done is passed a piece of legislation that has been it was pushed in the offshore oil industry for a long time, but now they've been able to get it into this area. And what this bill says is it's folded into a defense authorization bill, and it imposes new nationality requirements for crew members working on offshore energy projects, from oil rigs to wind installations. Crews have to be citizens or permanent residents of the U.S. or from the same country on which the vessel is flagged. Now, a lot of these vessels that operate in this are, for example, the Marshall Islands and these open registries, Panama, Liberia. And now what this says is it's fine. You can operate in the coastal waters doing some of this business that's not within violation of the Jones Act. However, your crew either has to be of the flag of the registry, Panama and Marshall Islands, or you have to use U.S. crew. And what you had was you were using open registries, foreign registries, and using non-Americans to do this work at a much lower pace. And the idea is to ensure that there are Americans working in this industry and it's not being farmed out. Again, you're going to have proponents of this who say this is great for American maritime industry, it's great for American mariners, and others will sit there and say you're raising the cost to do offshore wind by forcing us to employ Americans. Okay, I'm not sure what the right answer is on this. I do have an issue about bringing in foreign flag vessels working within U.S. waters and hiring crews from overseas at below U.S. minimum wages to work in U.S. territorial waters. I think that is an issue that we need to be very careful about. If not, why not just anchor a cruise ship in a U.S. harbor and run every hotel out of business in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco? Because you brought in a cruise ship, you tie it at a dock, and you run it as a floating hotel, and you pay your workers minimum wage in Panama versus the United States. So we've got to be very careful about what opens up the Pandora's box here. But an interesting, now just passed the House, hasn't gone through the Senate yet. It's not US law, but it's the beginning effort here. And I thought I'd start tracking it because we've watched the Ocean Shipping Reform Act go through US Congress. And now we're seeing this that impacts the oil and offshore wind economy. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, give it a thumbs up, share it across social media. And if you can support the page, please do so by two ways. One, you can hit the super thanks button below, contribute directly to this video. That helps us offset costs to put this video together and keep the staff here at what's going on with shipping, with food and power. The other thing is to go over to Patreon and become a patron of the page. You can give a contribution to the page, either monthly or an annual payment, and that allows you to support the efforts here at what's going on with shipping. Until our next video, this is Sal signing off.